Good morning. This is November 29th. I have I have been skipping for a few days um, because of my continuous book writing on the two title of the books that I hope this can be we can be sharing this by the second week of the end of February, maybe. As I have been promised myself, made myself the commitment, the beginning of this year's, the almost a week after the Chinese New Year, that I will be using the system of broadcasting, embracing the incoming or the existing, the new platforms with the new technologies, because we seem to be coming back to the earlier Greek or Chinese educational format, be that the three major Chinese, Confucius and Lao Tzu from with Tao, and the Buddha by way of India, and plus the Greek scholars. Homer was at the crossroad when he speak of the Greek mythology and also the his adventures. The books of Iliad and Odyssey were in that position just between the oration, the scriber system, and then eventually, I mean, the writing system happened to be dynamically into that passage of the Greek passing on their knowledges. And today, I will repeat as often as possible in the use of my this year until I keep myself until February to do as much as in what I call the value clarification, coming to the new system, for me, new system, speaking and acknowledging the entry now between the information technology and AI, where this speaking can be taped, can be immediately turned into narrative forms, and all can be using similar voice to broadcast into 140 plus 170 languages. And likewise, the books going to Amazon can produce into multiple languages. And also in the writing, what I have started right now, I'm predominantly using one of the AI assisted program, Claude. I found it to be very effective. What is happening when I'm writing things of the past? As you shall see in my book, I will be listing all my writing and their suggested questions to moving the idea forward. Nothing there is about plagiarism. This is where the added intelligence, meaning that I use it this way, using as a forensic study with better clarity when we look back, when you're driving, for drivers, when we have the blind spots. And by working with the AI assist programs like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, so far, and there'll be others in other languages, we can speak more proficiently. And this proficiency is being enhanced by technology. For those who love to look at history, as I do, I have been very thrilled researching on the Portuguese navigation, as many have found out that Columbus was not really from Italy per se, from Genoa, and he was in fact a native Portuguese born in the town called Cuba. And this is one references by my own way of conjugating when I come up with the comment about Columbus is Cologne. is Salvador invece Cristoforo or Christopher in the Italian and English form. Again, these are all hypotheses. But when you put more hypotheses with greater way to verify what you're expressing, and subsequently, I have created also www.openbooks.ai. The situation is very simple. We are decentralizing from once we watched in North America just the three news stations: ABC, CBS, NBC. Then eventually Turner showed up with the CNN, and now you have all sorts of news. And because the war situation in both Asia, potential conflicts, one in China, they comment situation and before broadcasting over the war with Russia, basically watched because at the time news broadcast from again to be dominated by one and the policy, this domination of news and their neutrality with necessity, because the Taiwanese broadcasters are not in accordance with the government's policy or heading into the Taiwan independence. And they know they are at stake. They know they can be in trouble. They know if any provocation between the Taiwan trying to entice the U.S. to come into the aid, if there was a conflict, if there was the situation between China, and the same way goes with the situation in the Philippines. So the news becoming more centralized into the Asian dimension. Just as much the broadcasting about Xi Jinping's visit into Chennai in Peru and the meeting of the APEC and also the G20, the broadcasting coming out from Taiwan's very, very professional broadcasters. And I tend to listen more to their broadcasting because the minute they have a main theme, the peripheral comments is all reflecting about the situation between China and Taiwan in the coming years. So this is more pertinent. In today's communication arena, we have so many options. We can look at the critiques, and I love to listen to Jeffrey Sachs and his idea about China, and also Masubani from Singapore, the former minister and the UN head of Singapore. Their comments seem to be giving me a much richer, much greater objectivity. That means a clearer assessment than all the other national news tinted by their sponsor, the ownership. So their broadcast had to follow certain kind of lines nationally or commercially. In what I'm going to speak of in this particular broadcast, and I'm also changing the format to do in a shorter version with a more specific topic from this last 5 years independent study, independent research since my college days in 1974, 75, 76, where I have developed at that particular timing point called the 3C system. Today, I am relabeling by calling this the 3C counseling system. And before that, I put down PRS. Well, the first 3C system involving the communication dynamics and also the communication analytica is the analysis of the communication between me and my students and the people in counseling with me beyond students. But in the middle of that, I had also developed a cultural sphere. So the three C's is becoming a counseling system, which in 1974 to 76, I was also, like all the other wonderful great psychologists, psychiatrists, educational psychologists, are delinking or gradually moving away from the cultural sphere of the Sigmund Freud psychoanalysis and uh, these sexual dynamics, psychosexual dynamics, because from the rigidity of the period I call the cultural sphere of the time and era of the Freudian in that Victorian era, the limitation of the mobility of the women, while the men have their own the pattern on behaviors, uh, the social or even sexual. I put it very simply for those who have access to Amazon. Download this free book. It's not because the pornographic, the hypersexual activity of this one gentleman. The book is called, um, if I recall, I'll put it back, but it's just a little mental block for the title of the book. But the book, from front to back, is all about this man's sexual behavior to the point where he gets saturated with his own heterosexual behavior now into his own direction into homosexuality and whatnot. I read that when I was in college and undergraduate even. What I have found in seeking what is the ambience for Sigmund Freud to have borrowed already as a cross-cultural psychologist, I call myself, he already crossing the culture, not from his own Judaic background, but borrowed from the Greek mythology, from Oedipus, and then eventually created Electra, uh, with the daughter and father, and then Oedipus is the son and mother, and the physical attachment, the linkage to have developed all the Sigmund Freud's fixations. But from time when Freud left left Austria, he died eventually in England with his daughter Anna Freud, continued with the psychoanalysis, where he had offered to Gustav Jung, where Jung basically had already taken away into search and the cultural elements with Jung's procurement of something in the more aesthetics and religious and cultural part of it. And then when it got to the U.S., the gradual transformation of the last sexual era, or the Puritan era of the Freudian society, one by one, all the psychologists evolving coming into the area of educational psychology in colleges. And just to name a few names, we talk about Rollo May, we talk about Alfred Adler, we talk about uh, Carl Rogers, whom I follow tremendously. I think is a very humanistic psychologist. And then we have the book, a therapist, a psychologist, totally basing the meaning of life, where he came out from the Nazi German camp with dealing with the victims whose family were victimized by the Nazi Germany camp. That was Viktor Frankl, his book Man Searching for Meaning. And then here comes also the another German Jewish American psychologist, Eric Fromm. His book, in my 50 years time, the only time anything about Asian values engaged into the field of psychology, was the book written by Eric Fromm called Psychoanalysis and Zen Buddhism. And basically, by my observation at that time, is that Fromm talk about psychoanalysis, and Suzuki from Japan talking about the steps of the Zen Buddhism, coming out from the Buddhist teaching. But what is very interesting, what I'm talking about, is the evolution and changes within the field of psychology. And what had me taken off to create the 3C counseling system was very much impacted by the first visual of, I call it the graphic use in psychology or imaging of the psychology, is where I start to take an interest with the teaching of the transactional analysis and his creator, Eric Berne. At that time, 74, 73, 74, he was still in Carmel, California. But what happens that with the development of my 3Cs is basically borrowing those three elements where Eric Burns had moved the Freudian superego, ego, and it into the parent, adult, and child. And with two sets of rounds, and he shows the transaction, how we using different voices. We talk as parents, or we talk as adult to adult in a equal level, and child to child, or child, and then the dynamic changes when you're talking to parent to child, child to parent, and then adult to child is like teacher to student, coach to student. The format of the variety of transactions, I had converted that with the three round shapes into the dynamics by the shapes of round, square, and triangle. What triangle is basically coming out from the two halves of the square when we are communicating in the round. And also, you have an ovalized round sphere. That means that we're talking, communicating, because we have a common theme in the particular subject matter. And then when we're talking about in the square, you can still be in that background, the communal cultural sphere. It was ovalized. And then we talk about changing, agreeing, disagreeing, or in hypothesis is no less than a conference call when you're talking about what do you think? We do this, we do that. We said, nah, we can do better on that. So it between the shapes changing of our interpersonal communication and dialogue, the background, if it's round or ovalized, or it also can become square. That means that the situation can become less and less agreeable. And then the final stage, which is not pleasant, is when the two square turning into two spear, confrontational, argumentation, accusation, finger pointing. I wanted to create that 3C counseling system is where also I become also evolved away from the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, which is much more clinical. And in the clinical format, the psychiatrist and the psychologist oftentimes, with their medical training, to apply medications to calm down situation or to minimize the anxiety level, which is a major word. And then by what I have attempted to do, I'm trying to make it into an everyday communication format. So from the Freudian psychoanalysis, I myself involving in this time and period, 74 I'm talking about, into a communication psychology, because I was visualizing how the psychology from its therapeutic format can become educational format. Number one, from my other previous recording, people can remember, I'm a cross-cultural individual. And I travel around the world for the last 50 years. And before that, I was born in Shanghai in 48, listening to the multiple dialects speaking by my mom and dad. My father is from Zhejiang, from Yuyao, upriver from Shanghai, but we all live in Shanghai. My mother is from Guangxi, west of the province of Guangdong, where she is originated from. So between the two of them, they speak the local dialect, they speak the Shanghai, and then the common language of Mandarin in that time and period is called Guanhua, or the language, official language of the court. And my maternal grandfather in Guangxi was a magistrate. He's one of the mandarins dressed in service in the court of the Qing rulers. So, in what I'm trying to, um, in this multicultural, cross-cultural background, and there are now studies around the U.S. universities. I think Buffalo was one of them, starting to researching the tonal influence in the pre-verbal age of youngsters when they were spoken to with the multiple languages. My mother was My brother Peter was born a year before me, so my mother had not the nutrition or milk to 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 give to me. So she retained a wet nurse who had carried me for maybe 2 to 3 years. I don't recall exactly. And she is coming from the outskirts of Shanghai. Today we know as Pudong, but in those days, a very remote area, the countryside and the very poor regions. So by the time from 48 to 52, I was in Shanghai. And 52 to 62, the family already moved into Hong Kong and then Macau. And for that 10 years, I'm returning back to the mother tongue of my mom, also spoken by her two sisters, two aunts, and the region of Hong Kong, Macau, the local language is Cantonese. So I do have this multiple language grasping, speaking, and I speak Mandarin today. I can get by with Shanghai, listening well, emulating in the last minute if I had just happened to spoken to somebody locally. I first and the most important of all, I enjoy languages. So from the multiple language to Macau, Catholic baptismal by again the known Roman Catholic Jesuit Matteo Ricci and his mission. His first was in Macau, and I was baptized by by name Father Minelli, and the other one is by a Spanish priest, Father Luis Ruiz, who is another legend in Macau in the last 20 years, 30 years, how he had built leprosarium inside China without ever having any conflicts or imposition by his religiosity as a Roman priest Jesuit. He was in Cuba before he got to Brazil. So 25 years later, I came back to Macau. And when in that week, we share our common language in the English and Portuguese and Spanish, Italians, and we sang in the mass with Gregorian Greek as I started in the mid 50s. In this linguistic multicultural upbringing and my 45 years working in this last 45 years directly, daily, weekly with the Brazilian gemstones and minerals to have created my business here in Lake Geneva for 45 years. And so it's a 50 years engagement with the speaking tongue of the Portuguese, plus in the peripheral of the Spanish engagement in my business, plus our mining in Uruguay and other engagement in Chile and in Peru. This passage, this journey in the West had given me a lot of thinking and reflection. We're all involving problem solving. I think men are made to be engaged to find way to resolve problem. From day one, when we left China, from my father's advice, even mothers, do not be engaged into politics, any place, anywhere. That's how they suffer. They have to left China in 48, and I'm still exploring why, but I find out more reasons that that history of my life that where my father have contributed greatly because he's bilingual early on, two foreign languages in the read and write um, of English and fluency in French because he went to Sorbonne, and then eventually in 52 he immigrated to Brazil, and then we follow 10 years later into Brazil. Just a very quick summary, but the exposure and the I love Brazil. It's the second home from home. And also lived in one of the most glorious periods, Brazil, with the sound economics, with coffee, with other exports, the 60s, or even say by late 50 to early 62s, until I left Brazil in 67 for college. We call it Época de Ouro. It's a golden period. The opulence in São Paulo city, and the internationalism in São Paulo, all that had enriched my use of languages: Portuguese, English, Chinese, different dialects, and then Spanish and Italian, all by choice. But the subject matter, I'm trying to keep in very, very brief. In this last 5 years, I got my master in 74, 75. I consider this my postmasters or my personal doctoral program ever since COVID or 2019. I left my business with my wife, Kathy, and I'm basically exploring in the same area of my creation of the 3C counseling system. However, with this last 45 years away from education, continuing with the global engagement, the multiculturalism, different pockets, visiting the tribal area in the Brazilian, from the northwest in the Rondônia, in the Roosevelt Reservation, meeting the in the Sintalargas and the Sakirabia, different tribes, and north to Rio Negro in Upper Amazon, meeting up with my old high school, junior high school, but now he's a bishop of all Brazil, called the Bispo dos Índios, Don Songi, also ethnic Chinese, born in Shanghai, but he's from a family of Catholics, moved to Hong Kong, Brazil. We met up in Lorena when I'm finished with my junior high school, which is the ninth grade compatible to the US. He was at the seminary school next to me. So Song eventually became the region of San Gabriel de Cachoeira in the northern part of Brazil, 70 kilometers south of the equator, and meeting up 32 ethnic groups, sharing 6 weeks of living in San Gabriel de Cachoeira in 2008 when I turned 60. All this had given me today, in the writing of the 2 books, I hope be done by February, what I have discovered, one huge cultural discrepancies is where I'm putting this date to 1492. It's an indicator of the expansion of the Western powers, starting with the Portuguese navigation and the intelligence way beyond the Spanish. And in fact, the 4 global expeditioner by ocean, the navigators, all coming of the influence of the Portuguese, also by the school of navigation named Prince Henry under the King John II. Prince Henry's navigation school started in the area called Sagres, which is next to Algarve, the southern part, the warm area of Portugal. And by 1460, 30 years before the finding of the Columbus voyage to the Antilles, in basically Hispaniola and Cuba, the Portuguese already had discovered Brazil. And this is part of my investigation, research, I love of history, is by the speed of the Portuguese when the Pope Alexander VI divided the line. They called it Tordesia, giving Portuguese the east in the Atlantic, meaning all Africa. Also knowing Portuguese have discovered India, China by Vasco da Gama, and why 2 years after the 1492 Columbus discovery of the Hispaniola, the Antilles, the Portuguese captain supposedly accidentally going into following Vasco da Gama to Asia, and got drifted away and landed in Brazil. His name was Pedro Álvares Cabral, 1500. And some 19 years later, but let me finish the point about the Tordesillas. This is where the Portuguese fought vehemently, and John II, the king, is almost in his final life stage, fought to gain, wanting to have 370 extra sea leagues, because they were going west, they captured the entire continent of Brazil. So the last Portuguese navigator, most of you in the West know him as Magellan, his name is Fernão Magalhães, was employed by the Spanish court. Again, he followed the Portuguese rules, going coasting on the entire South America, and eventually he found his own Magellan Strait, crossing over in the southern part of Argentina, and eventually gone on to find the Ocean Pacific, with a stop over to present-day Guam, used to know Isla de los Ladrones, means the island of the thieves. Eventually he found the Las Filipinas, turned out to be the name of the king, Philip II, when he was a prince, named after Spain, and then eventually the Philippines. So this expansion, the Portuguese starting with the navigation, and the Spanish expanded. And the Spanish Empire, if you look back for 250 years, since 1500s, they have the Pacific Islands of the Philippines, and coming with called the Manila galleons, carrying silver from South America. Bolivia Potosí was not bearing any name. They were using the region, using a Portuguese name, but the capitany or the viceroyalty in Peru had moved all the silver up north to Mexico, on New Spain, or Nueva España, in using the port of Acapulco, and then transferred the silver into Manila, using the residents in Manila, the ethnic Chinese live outside the city of Manila, Coparion, who are the Chinese today we know from Fujian, who spoke the language Miannan, also used in Taiwan. And the silver, they kept their own quinto, or 1/5 of money, the silver, go to Mexico, went from the east to Veracruz using the ports transport, and then to Spain. And the silver had carried on the rise of Ming Dynasty, because there was ample silver that had created trade in the procurement of the Chinese silk, Chinese products by way of Manila to Spain, by way of Acapulco, cross the Atlantic to Spain. So this is worth all to study, how that silver from Bolivia had affected the rise of Ming Dynasty, because the increase of trade, in part with Spain, and Spain had used the silver, had done all their battles. But once the silver become depleting, the decline of Ming, and also decline of the Spanish power. So after the Spanish rise of the Iberian power, then we talk about the next three evolutions, from the steam engine to the robber baron days of electricity, and talk about petroleum, the railroad system, the robber baron days, and then the last evolution is the use of in what we talk about is the IT, information technology. The empire expanded, and in all this power expansion in the 1700s, the British had controlled, dominated, colonized India. And that's where the opium eventually were planted in the Bangladesh area of India. And China is starting to become defeating by the West by the early 1800s, in part because the decline of the Qing dynasty, or in part also impacted by the consumption of the opium, which had impacted the weakening of the Chinese intellectual, the young people, or the rich, the affluent people. So what I'm trying to say is that this is not a, any accusation. As I rephrase it again, ignorance is not a crime and also not a sin. We go through life in our culture with a great deal of ignorance. Now we are so eager in wanting to know about the history of the rich Sumerian with the many, many skills. If the language in those cuneiform can be translated, can ever break the code and translate, there will be enormous knowledge that can passing on to us. Look at the European obsession with the Egyptian history, characters, and symbolism. Look at the symbolism of the Mayan, the Aztec, the Olmec, and the Incas. The Aztecs had the impeccable cleanliness in the way they kept their culture. But what happened? All the invaders, conquistadores, all these people taken Egypt, including maybe the Babylonians, the Aryans, or the Greeks who had invaded in that part of Iran, Mesopotamia, India, China. These intruders are not the people with culture. One more. I'm raised Roman Catholic. I'm very proud of the many Roman Catholic achievement, accomplishment academically, music, or the conversion of the Latin, the lingua franca of the Latin into Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and French. Without the Italian Renaissance, without the speaking Italian, we will never know about the richness of the book written by Dante Alighieri, Divine Comedy. However, in the linguistic education of era and the time and period, including scholars, Greek scholars with the Roman Catholic tradition, they were absolutely ignorant about the culture of the Chinese, no less than the Roman did to the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Greeks have done to the Mesopotamia. Well, I'm thinking about Alexander the Great, how far he gone into almost to the border of China in the area, what we know about mixing with the Aryan, the nomadic tribes from the Cossack area, the high plateau region of Iran and the northwest of India. None of them had any appreciation. They are destroying some of the rich culture of the Sumerians or the Egyptians. And likewise, this huge mistake by me pursuing the subject matter of conscience, put it into now conscience psychology, and the first book is the pedagogy of conscience, which I'm trying to limit the 300 pages, all done in less than 4 days, into a compact, usable, functional books. Or I will produce these books into 1, 2, 3, 4 segments. But what my discovery has shown that the total West misunderstanding of China until today, when you talk about the United States today want to use 16 billions to a system where we can build a propaganda to demonize China, in part or in whole, as I've had my warning years ago about Dwight Eisenhower, about the military-industrial complex. If and when nations want to produce false evidence to go to war and just to benefit the 1%, 2% of the affluent people in a society, for me, this is a huge perversion. And this is why I am trying very hard to highlight the differences. Why am I pushing conscience studies? Why am I so influenced by the conscientization? The only one few of the scholars that using conscientization as a methodology to foster his teaching education in Brazil. And because of Paulo Freire, he had brought me back to my thinking, linking back to the teaching of Wang Yangming, the 14th century Chinese scholar. In his teaching called Xin Shi, the learning from the heart, basically summarized the confluential study of the Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Buddha. Of course, that eventually there's also the segment I Ching, linking the pre-written language of the Shang dynasty, of the Shah era, of the primitive era, where the first creation of the Tai Chi, the two opposing forces squaring round. And this is where I think we can be alerting the world, lighting, that the teaching of conscience can be just as good, if not better, in comparison to the Western values. And here is the cultural mistake that I see. In the language of the Roman Catholic missionary representing the educational area, and eventually you will find out how the Jesuits had influenced the world and how they were penalized even by the system of both Spain and Portugal, want to eliminate and kick them out of the entire Americas, because the efficiency of the Society of the Jesuits had given the only bilingual indigenous language and Spanish, meaning Guarani and Spanish, in Paraguay. And also by the same academic driven Jesuits. The first Jesuits landed into China by way of Macau, where's the place I got baptized, I got Romanized in the learning Latin and Greek, was Matteo Ricci. And this is now becoming a future research where I first will embrace all the Jesuits entities or individuals, online, offline, in North America first. And then I will be approaching the Brazilians in the area of the Paulo Freire School, Paulo Freire's Institute, to highlight this aspect of the Jesuits' work. And in the Jesuits' work, also have another link to the school system where I studied and graduated from. It's the Salesians by Don Bosco from Torino. What I found out is very interesting moving forward by exploring the study and the writing of Matteo Ricci, who has suggested that by his observation, the society in China he had perceived need not to be evangelized. And by this observation, I'm not sure the time frame of the Inquisition, but he almost came very close to be rescinded by Rome, by Vatican, because by the two other parties, religious groups in Asia, along with the Jesuits, were the Dominicans and the Franciscans. However, the Dominicans, if anybody recall, as I do, the famous Spanish Inquisition under the most brutal, most cruel inquisitor by the name of Tomás de Torquemada. But what I'm trying to say, Matteo Ricci is one of the few Westerners who had already perceived the good societies in China, and by commenting that Chinese do not need to be evangelized, but rather to find a system that can harmonize between the Catholic value and the Chinese value. And this is where I think, and I inviting all scholars, I'm inviting all teachers and those seekers with curiosity. And for 500 plus years, again, I'm using 1492, the West had ignored the richness, a non-theist, non-God based Chinese in their exercise and the awareness, teaching of human conscience, which is talk about having a kind heart. But symbiotically, there's a twinning between being kind and being good. You cannot be kind unless you also have the goodness as the base. And that goes back to the very simple, the Confucius called a three-letter scripture, 三字经. And I use Cantonese. Maybe this phonetically sounds more interesting. 人之初，性本善. In the beginning of man, we have kindness in us. Just think about the embryonic fluid for that 8, 9 months, 10 months. So what I'm trying to suggest, again, everything, as I said before, everything we said here today, in the use of the open books in the future, every second, if this is coming to a transcript, participants sign in, can critique, can comment, can add. So eventually we're all writing books and books and books with continuity, with their thinking without interruption. Not as before, you have to read the entire book, the entire content until you can share. I think this immediacy, the immediate learning, by me, the immediate clearance of any question mark, as I'm doing now with Claude, with ChatGPT, is a good instrument. So by what I'm trying to tell you and how this mistake was made about China, about the Chinese values, is linguistically, I repeat, I'm waiting for the very last minute to say, because not being able to understand the teaching of Confucius or the teaching of Lao Tzu or the teaching of Buddha, for the Romanized, Latinized language of the Western scholars put the Chinese three branches, the main branches, plus others in other country, other religious perception. Behind it's called ism, ISM. The Western culture coming out predominantly under one monotheist Abrahamic culture. From the Abrahamic rooftop, here comes Judaism. Here comes Roman Catholicism, and even Islamism, all until the time of Luther, when Protestants and the rebel is called Protestantism. And subsequently, when they label Confucius is Confucianism, Lao Tzu is Taoism, and Buddha is Buddhism. Now borrow a newer form of psychological element. This is exactly what the Freudian term using called projection. I put you into my knowledge domain. So this form of making the Chinese three teaching disciplines all into the religious or religiosity in the West. And I hope I will continue later, but this is the subject matter that I would like to address. And I hope I get feedbacks. Also, I hope people can disseminate and question in what I have said have any kind of validity or can there be other form of deviation? But I think this 600, almost 500 plus years of mistake, linguistically, by calling all the Chinese teachings into the religious realm of the West. And of course, let me repeat, conscience cannot be taught. Conscience is a summary of our thinking, introspection, reflection, imagination. And this adds to the complexity, not being able to summarize the Chinese thinking, philosophy, and the Chinese education. It's all three in one. This is all for today, and I will do my best to continue with my book and also with my advocacy about conscious awareness, um, conscious psychology in the future segments. Thank you.